you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I know on any given Wednesday morning there are a lot of places we could be, so I really appreciate you being in this room, and you look beautiful this morning. I'm really honored to be invited to come speak at Delta College, and are we doing okay with sound? Okay. I'm really grateful to be having this conversation with you this morning. It feels like an important time to be having this conversation. So I am a storyteller who lives in a body that is often at odds with the built world. And my hope is that as I share some of my stories with you this morning, that I could offer you something useful, a new lens, maybe a new perspective, maybe new language, to add to and enhance the way you think about disability, accessibility, and maybe even what it means to live life tethered to these bodies that we live in. So, to begin, a story. All right, it was indeed a dark and stormy night. This story takes place in my very first semester of graduate school. Please enjoy my early days of Instagram, heavily filtered, pixelated photo of that night. This is a picture of me with my new friend Shane, who's on the right, and my new friend Amanda on the left. So Shane and I were heading to Amanda's house on this dark, stormy night. We get to Amanda's apartment complex, and we sort of race across this slick, wet parking lot, and are huddling under the shelter of this apartment complex, just sort of gathering our bearings, and sitting at the bottom of this towering staircase. The stairs were not a surprise. We knew that Amanda lived on the 3rd floor of this apartment complex, so stairs were going to be a part of the evening. Still, I kind of steeled myself for this part of the ritual, which is the part of the night where my friends sort of divvy up the task, divvy up the labor of getting me and my wheelchair from one place to the next. So Amanda meets us at the bottom of these stairs. Her job is going to be to carry my wheelchair back up these stairs, and she lifts it up by the wheels, which means that the frame sort of flips back and thwacks her in the shins right before she's going to head back up these 3 flights of stairs, this time with a 30-pound mobility aid in tow. Anyone who spends time with wheelchairs knows the whole drill, right? So, and I sort of take a deep breath, getting ready for Shane to scoop me up and carry me up these 3 flights of stairs. Now, I don't know the last time you were carried anywhere by someone, but to me, the experience of being carried by someone when you are neither their infant nor their bride can be a little bit of an awkward experience sometimes. It's intimate, right? You're like smushed up together like 2 teenagers making out on the couch, but you're also like totally dependent on them the way that maybe an infant would be, and it can be embarrassing, kind of hilarious, awful, and also sort of sweet. And so just to sort of like cut through the tension of the moment, I start crooning in Shane's ear in my best old-timey voice, and I sing, "Isn't it romantic?" And Shane is like trying to laugh, but he's also feeling he's out of breath, and he's like trying to find the next step with his foot. And my shame about this whole situation is like throbbing at this point, right? These are my new friends, and they're panting, trying to get me upstairs, and I'm willing it to end, and we finally get to the 3rd floor of this apartment, and I'm like wild-eyed saying, just like, throw me on the couch. And they walk me over to the couch and help me down, and Amanda takes my chair and brings it up next to me, and then they sort of like collapse on the other end of the couch while I'm just thanking them profusely for this whole scene. There are a lot of layers to living in a body that is so often at odds with the built world. But one of the hardest parts of that whole setup for me has always been the worry, the fear of being a burden on the people around me, right? It's a feeling that can make me feel like, maybe it'd be better if I just didn't go. Maybe it'd be better if I just stayed home this time. So later that night, my friends carry me back down the 3 flights of stairs, and Shane is driving me home in the rain, and he's just sort of humming to himself in Shane fashion, and I'm sitting there with my cheek against the window, just like spiraling a little bit. These are my new friends, and I'm thinking, like, is Shane gonna think twice before he asks me to hang out again? And finally I just blurt out, I'm so sorry you had to carry me up and down those stairs. And I knew what Shane was gonna say, because it's the same thing that most people say in that situation, which is like, no big deal, like easy peasy, we wanted you there, which is all kindly meant. But I'm there for the whole scene, right? Like, I see the perspiration and the strained muscles, and none of it looks easy peasy. But Shane said something different. Shane said, well, I'm sorry, that apartment complex doesn't have an easy way for you to get inside. And it was a tiny reframe, right? But it actually stunned me in that moment, because Shane was saying, like, okay, there was a problem there, right? Something happened, but you weren't the problem in that situation. Like, that design wasn't great. That place was really inaccessible, and that is a problem. And I had never thought about it that way before. The way we build the world tells a story about who we imagine will live in that world. It tells a story of who we imagine belongs here. And so after a lot of years of living in the world, moving through the world in this wheelchair, I kind of came to believe that I didn't really belong. I didn't always believe that. These are some pictures of me from the early days. I've been paralyzed since about the age of 3. I don't remember walking, but the photo, I don't know how well you can see these. The photos on the far right is a picture of me in a little blue stroller with my dad. There's a picture of me holding onto both of my parents' hands as I'm making my way across the grass on field day. And then a picture of me on my dad's shoulders, just kind of hanging out, which was a way I got around a fair amount. Before I got my wheelchair, I just sort of moved my body intuitively. I got around in whatever way made the most sense with my body and the environment. So I crawled everywhere. I would pull myself up on kitchen counters and use door frames. I had this little red tricycle that I would pedal all over the neighborhood, mostly with my hands, just wandering around. It was the 80s and 90s, so like a little bit of a different time. But I got where I wanted to go, and I didn't see too much of a problem with that. When I started school, I got my first wheelchair, and again, 90s, so it was definitely hot pink. And I very quickly, eventually, I covered it in really tacky neon smiley face stickers, which was a very, very cute look. I'm sorry that you missed that. But I grew up visibly and physically disabled, and really, at first, I did not make too much of that. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, so I was always just one of the pack. I played really hard. I would make up these like elaborate dance routines in my wheelchair, and I pictured myself leading a troupe of dancers one day. I felt really beautiful, like I was the kid who would put on a full dress-up gown just to go to the library. And I think at the heart of it, I just saw myself as a valuable part of the group. And that feeling of feeling equal and a part of things kind of slowly started to disintegrate. It was this slow and steady process of piecing together where I fit or didn't fit in the world around me, where disability fit or didn't fit into that world. A lot of folks with disabilities I know and have met experience bullying and cruelty and even abuse, and none of that really was the case for me. I mean, the things that I learned about disability, I learned in like 1,000 tiny and enormous ways. I think the way that we learn about the world, especially when we're younger, can often be so subtle that we don't really realize that we're learning anything at all. And so for me, no one said the words like, "we don't want you around." And yet, I lived in a world that was not built to include me, right? I spent a lot of time on the edges of inaccessible playgrounds, the end of the lunch table, which was the only spot my wheelchair could scoot in, inaccessible gym classes and birthday parties, and I felt all the friction and inconvenience that came with simply trying to exist out in public. Like for me or for anyone with me, it was always like, oh, how are we gonna get in this building, or how are we going to include her on this field trip? It felt elaborate. It felt like too much, always leaving the group to find a different route. I always felt disruptive. And then there were all of the spaces that were like technically accessible, but like in almost in a way that underscored disability as a separate kind of experience. So, like the beautiful building with the grand staircase up front, and then you kind of wander around the back to find the ramp tucked in next to the dumpsters, or there's the lift that's in front of the building, but you can only access the lift with a key that happens to be inside the building that you can't access, right? There's all kinds of these roundabout, clunky ways of creating accessibility. No one ever said the words to me, "You don't belong here," and yet I saw kids like me put on a separate school bus, separate from the other kids in our school. Growing up, I did hear messages like, you can be anything you want to be, but even as a kid, I was a little skeptical of that. Like, really? What would that even look like? I had never seen in real life or represented on screens a visibly disabled doctor or teacher or newscaster or barista. So after, a decade or so of living on this planet and moving through the world in this way, I slowly and eventually pieced together that disability meant you're on the outside. And I would not have had the words to describe it this way at the time, but in retrospect, I think it felt a little bit like being a little alien bobbing through outer space, like light years away from planet Earth, and I was someone to gawk at, or maybe even marvel over. But either way, I didn't belong. So, how does a person survive that setup? Like, what do you do when you piece together that there's something about you that means that you fundamentally don't fit into the world around you, you don't belong? I think there have to be as many responses to that as there are humans. But for me, what I did was I learned to hide my disability. And that might sound like an odd thing to say because wheelchairs are quite visible. You can't just put on an extra big scarf and move along. But I did it in a lot of different ways. I learned to make my needs very small. So go with the flow, pretend like inaccessibility doesn't cost me anything. Like whatever you do, don't make a fuss about any of this. I stayed in my wheelchair more and more. I noticed the ways that I moved my body seemed kind of unexpected to the people around me, so I just kind of stayed in my chair more and more. I learned to dress in ways that hid the parts of me that I felt like looked more disabled. The photos I have on the slide here are just a couple of many from this time period, long before we were editing photos on our phones. I found ways to sort of curate the images that I wanted to. So the photo on the left here is a picture of one of many from school dances that I went on, where my wheelchair is whisked out of the frame and I'm sitting, somehow it's preferable to be sitting in like a plastic lawn chair, but I have so many pictures of me from that time. The photo on the right here, you're right, is a picture I took for my high school boyfriend. So back in the day, we would like put pictures of each other up in our lockers, and in the bygone era, and my boyfriend wanted a picture of me for his locker, and so I like put on my really cute outfit and I had my friend come over to take this picture of me, and we actually went to the shop to get it developed. And when I got them back and I was looking at them, I saw this picture and I liked it, except I noticed, oh man, my legs look so paralyzed in this picture, which makes sense because they are, but I got out like an actual pair of scissors and cut my legs out of the photo, like disability kind of scrubbed clean from the image, and that was the picture that I handed to my boyfriend. So the goal with all of this was to make disability like such a small part of me that I could pass as normal, and I could maybe slip under the radar and be included. I could create the image of fitting in, even if I didn't actually fit in to this world, which is essentially a little bit of a shame exercise, right? Brené Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And when it became clear to me that I did not fit into this world, I didn't blame the world, I didn't blame the designs or the environment around me. I didn't see the built world as a problem. My brain concluded that I was fundamentally, inescapably, unavoidably the problem here, that my unbelonging was somehow like built into my body. Now, I realize that what I'm diving into here is rough, right? This is a painful stretch of years. And I want to make sure that as I talk about this, that I paint this picture as accurately and fully for you as I can. Because even as I am like working so hard to fit in and keep up and be fine and normal, I also just like kept living my life, right? I think it's kind of amazing the burdens, the unkind lies that we can carry with us without anyone around us really knowing that. And when you live with shame for so long, it can sort of become the white noise in the background. Like it's shaping your reality without ever really announcing itself. And I definitely don't want to paint a picture of my life in these years as like overwhelmingly sad and tragic, like me sitting forlorn in my wheelchair, like looking out the window at all of the happy non-disabled people living their lives. Like that is not what it looked like. And that's not even what it felt like. Just like the story with my friend Shane carrying me up the 3 flights of stairs, I think that shame can coexist with a lot of other things, including love, including joy. I think that's the both and of so much of life. So at this time, this rough stretch, this both and time, the shame really did lead me into some rough patches. I got into a marriage really young that was not great and was divorced shortly after. I ended up dropping out of school. I think at the heart of it, during these years of like transitioning into adulthood, I really just lost my ability to dream for myself. Now, I do hope, as I am sitting here on this stage talking about all of these things, it's very clear that some things have changed between then and now, right? These days I rarely see my disability as the problem in any given room, and if I can trace us back to the beginning of some of that shift, that deep shifting in me, that deep shift in perspective, it really started with education. So eventually I did go back to school. And I kind of stayed as long as I possibly could. I stayed as long as they would let me. And I started my PhD in my late 20s. And that first year of graduate school, I wonder if this is familiar to anyone in the first year of any schooling. It was brutal. It was a lot. It was a lot to adjust to. I was like pouring my heart and body and soul into trying to keep up and fit in. And like every class period was my chance to prove that I belonged there, which is maybe like the worst way to learn anything. I remember that first year, all of the social gatherings that the grad students did, like the lit magazine meetings and the graduate readings, they were always hosted in like the hippest, least accessible venues, like the second floor of that hole-in-the-wall bar that you can only access through that steep, dark, narrow staircase. And for all of this, I did not voice a word of protest, right? Like I wanted to belong, so I'm not gonna make a fuss, right? Like I wanna fit in here. And just like I did with Shane, I put on my like easy breezy smile and I would ask someone I kind of knew from one of my classes to maybe carry me up 3 flights of stairs. This is a picture from one of those events that I showed up to where I didn't realize the only way to get there was 3 flights of stairs. And But more often than not, I kind of just stopped going, right? I stopped participating. And by the end of that first year, I was planning on leaving. Like, clearly for all of this effort, I didn't actually belong in this program. I couldn't cut it, so I was planning my exit. And it was just around that time, right before I made that switch official, that I found this book that was actually even pretty old when I found it, but it's called Enforcing Normalcy. And it was written by a disability studies scholar, which is something that I did not know existed in all of the classrooms that I had been in all of the years that I had been in school. Disability had never been a part of that conversation, right? It was like something that you talked about with your doctor in the hospital or like at the wheelchair seating clinic. It wasn't like this conversation for academic rigor. And so I was stunned that it existed at all. And when I opened this book, I ran into these words in just a few pages, and I'm actually going to read this section of the chapter to you because it was transformative to me. So picture I'm sitting in like my $5 thrifted green velvet chair, bone weary from graduate school, totally burned out, and I run into these words. Disability is not an object, a woman with a cane, but a social process that intimately involves everyone who has a body and lives in the world of the senses. The object of disability studies is not the person using the wheelchair or the deaf person, but the set of social, historical, economic, and cultural processes that regulate and control the way we think about and think through the body. Okay. I don't know how this lands for you. Maybe this sounds like dry academic speak, but I kid you not, when I ran into these words, I felt like this ocean of tears that I had been sort of keeping in my belly start to sprout up out through my throat and through my eyes, right? Because this writer was suggesting that there was not something fundamentally broken or ill-fitting about me, like inscribed into my legs, but that the world had been organized in such a way, the story had been told in such a way to push me out of it and into that role of the alien bobbing around through outer space. So this reading led to so much more reading for me, and it marked this important internal shift in my perspective. So I learned things like, before the year 1840, the word normal was used by carpenters to describe something as perpendicular, no attachment to human assessment whatsoever. Around the same time, and very closely related to this notion of normal, the notion of average as it relates to human beings started to come to life right around the same time. So originally, finding averages was mostly, it was a mathematical tool that was mostly used by astronomers to more accurately track planets, until Adolf Quetelet became obsessed with finding averages for human characteristics. He was obsessed. He wanted all the data. He wanted to know all about like the average width of a man's chest and the average circumference of a man's thigh, but also all about the averages with marriages and divorces. He wanted all of the data. And Quetelet's approach to this data wasn't just like his own fringe side hobby. Like this way of thinking about humans and data, this notion of finding averages for humans really caught on like wildfire at this time. And it fundamentally transformed the way that we think about people and organize people and build the world for people. Now, it's not like there's no purpose of gathering data and averages on human populations. It can be really useful to compare, two distinct groups of people. It helps us track larger patterns, like how populations are voting or the tracks of a virus, right? Disparities between groups. The problem is that so often we've used this notion of normal and average in ways that don't actually make sense. Because what group averages don't give us is any meaningful insight about individual people. And yet, we use statistical averages in our notions of normal as our North Star. Normal became the prototype at the center of our imaginations, inspiring our designs and fundamentally shaping our dreams. So This is kind of an abstract idea. I want to give you a concrete example of what I mean here, just to illustrate not only what I'm talking about, but the high stakes of this way of thinking and the profound limitation of building the world and using averages as our prototype in our designs. So I'm going to tell you a story. This story is pretty widely known. I first read about it in Sarah Hendren's book, What Can a Body Do?, which I highly recommend. It's also included in Todd Rhodes' book, The End of Average. But here's the story. So it's the 1940s, and the US Air Force realizes that they have a huge and mysterious problem on their hands. Their pilots keep crashing their planes, and they can't figure out what's going on. They can't figure out the problem. And at first they assume human error, like the pilots must be bungling the job, there's something insufficient in their training, but they follow that path. It doesn't really lead them anywhere. They start looking scrupulously for any kind of mechanical flaw. There's maybe something wrong with the engines. Again, it doesn't really lead anywhere. And eventually, they take meticulous measurements of 4,063 pilots, endless measurements of the bodies of each of these pilots, and they come up with the 10 characteristics that they deem the most essential for the act of flying a plane. And they crunch all those numbers and they calculate the averages for those 10 dimensions, those 10 characteristics. And those numbers become sort of the measurement of their average pilot, or the prototypical pilot flying these planes. And just to make sure that those 10 numbers match as many real-life pilots as possible, they open up those dimensions by 30%. So any pilot who is measuring within 30% of the averages that they came up with for these dimensions is going to fall within their parameters of their average pilot, according to their own calculations. So everyone expected most pilots would fit in with those parameters, right? That's how the logic would go. I'm curious what you would guess. How many pilots out of 4,063, how many do you think fit those average parameters? 400? Any other guesses? 400 is a great guess. It's actually 0. Yeah. Not one out of 4,063 pilots actually matched those averages, even when they were opened up by 30%. And in fact, they played with it a little bit and they said, okay, what if it was just 3 out of 10? How many pilots would match any three of these characteristics out of 10? And that brought them to about less than 3.5% of the pilots actually matched that. In other words, designing for the quote unquote average pilot meant that they were coming up with designs that worked for very few of their pilots. So the Air Force took very swift action to fix this problem, and they demanded that their airplanes be manufactured, redesigned in all 10 of those dimensions for pilots that measured anywhere between 5 and 95% of the averages that they had gathered. And at first, the airplane manufacturers were like, well, that's impossible. That can't be done. And even if it technically could be done, like, the price tag would be so astronomical. But the Air Force did not budge. And it wasn't really on principles of including anyone or being fair to anyone. It was because they had this very real and urgent, pressing problem on their hands that needed to be fixed like yesterday, right? Like, they were losing a lot of money, that human life was at risk. Like, we have to fix this problem. And wouldn't you know, they did. The engineers, in fact, figured it out relatively quickly and relatively cheaply. They designed adjustable foot pedals and helmet straps and flight suits. They designed adjustable seats, which is a technology I'm assuming you're pretty familiar with because it's now standard technology in cars. Imagine driving a car that doesn't have an adjustable seat. I would suffer. So it's interesting to think about this bit of history and this shift in the story. I don't know how you feel hearing about this bit of history, but as I read about notions and the history of the concept of average and normal, it felt to me a little bit like the physics of the universe were changing in real time. This was right around the time just after Shane had carried me up those 3 flights of stairs at the apartment complex, and instead of focusing on my deficiencies, he lamented the design. And these ideas that were at one time theoretical were becoming very real and personal to me. I had spent a lifetime believing that the disruption and labor and awkwardness that appeared whenever my body met the built world was evidence of my insufficiency, as if my existence was like some kind of inconvenience for humanity. But that moment with Shane felt different, and my perspective was starting to shift, and the world around me was starting to look different. When we design the world for the average prototype, we build worlds that only work for some of us, and even then, only temporarily. Folks that are pushed furthest to the edges in our designs and systems, of course, are going to feel the failings of this approach most acutely. So while the US Air Force sort of solved this problem in the 1940s, America kind of continued to build and plan for the quote-unquote average person. So through the 70s, folks with disabilities grew up in communities where they couldn't go to school, couldn't get into a courthouse or a post office or a library, could be fired or not hired simply because of, and solely because of their disability, with no path to recourse for that. Many children who were born with disabilities or acquired disabilities were sent to live in institutions. That was a really common norm. The photo on the left here is a picture that was taken from the now infamous Willowbrook institution that was known to be have horrible conditions for children. A lot of people couldn't leave their houses because the infrastructure didn't anticipate or imagine them. The photo on the right here is a picture of protesters who are literally smashing curb cuts into the concrete to make a space for them to have access to their neighborhoods and cities. So at this time, up until the 70s, so many folks with disabilities really remained invisible from our communities, right? Separated by institutions or by infrastructure. 1977 became a tipping point in this story. So disability activists who are included in this photograph, Judy Heumann and Kitty Cohn, led a group of over 150 protesters, most of whom had disabilities, into a federal building. And what started as a peaceful protest turned into a sit-in that lasted almost a month. It was 24 days that those protesters stayed and lived in that building. And they were refusing to leave until the government agreed to enact Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It was this tiny little bit of legislation. I think it was less than 50 words, but it was the first piece of legal the law that would essentially make it illegal for disabled people to be discriminated against, to be excluded from any part of public life that received federal funding. So this would be public schools, government buildings, libraries, public transportation, the post office, and none of this was an easy fight. It was actually a really brutal, exciting, life-changing 24 days, especially for the people who lived inside of that building. The federal government, maybe to no one's surprise, was working very hard to shut this down. Like this was not good optics in any imagination. They did not want to sign the regulations, just like the airplane manufacturers. They claimed that these protesters, these disability activists, were asking for way too much. It was going to be too expensive and actually impossible to implement. So the government cut off the water supply in the building. They cut off the phone lines in the building. The protesters had been communicating with the press almost every day, and they cut off access to the outside world. And so the protesters who knew ASL, American Sign Language, started sending messages through the windows. They were signing to people on the outside to continue that communication. 8 of the protesters went on a hunger strike, and finally, after 24 days, they got the signatures that they needed. The government agreed to implement the regulations as they were. I am really fascinated by the stories of the folks who participated in this sit-in, because it clearly transformed them. So many people gathered together who had lived their whole lives sort of being told or shown or seen as pitiful, as weak, as expendable, gathered together and insisted on their inherent belonging in their communities, their right to belong in their communities. One of the protesters, Helene DeLille, who actually took a lot of the photographs that I have on the slides here today, she documented the experience of those 24 days in her book called Becoming Real in 24 days. And she describes how through this process of insisting on their right to belong in their communities, that for so many protesters, it felt like they became real people, like actual humans, many of them for the first time. And one of the protesters leaving the building is recorded as saying, "We are beautiful, we are powerful, we are strong, we're important." And honestly, learning about this fight for inclusion made me see myself differently too. I mean, growing up in the 90s, my experience of the world told me that I didn't belong, and somehow 40 years before I was born, Judy Heumann, Kitty Cohn, these protesters believed so deeply in their inherent belonging that they insisted that the planners and builders create a world that reflected that belonging. So Section 504 laid vital groundwork for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law in 1990. So Section 504 only applied to the spaces that received federal funding, but the ADA expanded those provisions into the public sphere, or the private sphere. And the ADA continues to be one of the most comprehensive pieces of protective legislation for disabled people in the world. The ADA slowly has started to change the built world, right? We see curb cuts more often, handrails in bathrooms and wider doorways and lifts and elevators, and these all became part of our landscape in a way that has almost become easy to take for granted in some ways on some days. And not just for folks who use wheelchairs, right? But for people pushing strollers and food carts and people with rolling luggage and people with aging bodies or bodies in pain or people walking with small children, right? Like when we build the world to include the people on the edges, when we design to create access for those bodies and minds, we build sturdier designs and more sustainable solutions to hold all of us. And we see this over and over again. I mean, some of the tools that we rely on the most were originally designed specifically for folks with disabilities. You think about something like closed captioning, a tool that was created for folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, and now anyone on their phone or watching the game at the bar is accessing content that way, right? Everything from audiobooks to the grippy handle on an apple peeler, electric toothbrushes, speech to text and voice recognition apps, bendy straws were all originally designed specifically with disability in mind. And all of these tools are essentially the applied products of what we call universal design. It's this approach to design that looks not to the most quote unquote normal prototype, but to the ones on the edges. So inventors and designers who practice universal design, they don't see the exceptional person as this like problem to overlook or work around, but as a host of clues about what we need to create more sustainable solutions. Like we know how to do this work. We've known how to do this work for some time. And yet in many big and important ways, we continue to build the world as if the average pilot, the average student, the average child, the average worker was a real thing. We continue to let this idea of the normal sort of captivate our imaginations. And that, to me, really gets to the heart of what we would call ableism, right? It's building the world around and for the mostly imaginary prototype of normal and leaving everyone else out to dry, kind of scrambling to figure out how are we going to keep up or fit in within this system. And of course, the greater the deviation from that prototype in the middle, the greater the risk of discrimination and inaccessibility, and often, not always, but often, the greater risk of the shame that we feel for not matching that prototype. So I was learning all of these earth-shifting ideas in grad school. I had grown up essentially assuming that the way the world worked was the way it had to work, almost like the law of gravity or something. But learning history and language, to me, it felt like it revealed the script behind the performance or the coding behind the program, which meant that it could change right? Like the way that we think about people and organize people and build the world for people could change. So at this time, my mind was just sort of spinning with so many questions and reinterpretations, and all of it felt so personal. So I started writing. I started writing these little reflections and tidbits, and I started calling them like little mini memoirs of what life felt like from my particular specific point of view. I wanted to give language to this experience. I didn't want to be erased. I wanted to insist like I am real and alive and a part of this world. I wanted a new script, and so in some ways I kind of set to work writing a new one for myself. I wrote about things like, I don't know, like the businesses who use their accessible parking spaces for their garbage bins, or the horrors of flying when you use a wheelchair, or the bar down the street from my house that did a total renovation and didn't make anything more accessible in the renovation. I wrote about the impossible maze of trying to find affordable, accessible housing, how all of the places that I looked to live were either like pretty affordable and profoundly inaccessible, or beautifully accessible and astronomically expensive. So I wrote and I wrote and I wrote until that writing evolved into a book, and that book came out in 2020. And through that process of writing and processing and sharing and connecting with so many more people around these ideas of disability and accessibility and inclusion and access, I started to realize kind of like a second wave of realizations for me. I already knew and felt to my bones why these stories were so important to me, but I really started to feel why these stories were about so much more than me. And one of the first things that I started to recognize is just how many people around us have disabilities. And I guess I technically knew the numbers, right? Like the CDC estimates that around 61 million adults in the US have some kind of disability, which is 1 in 4. I just hadn't really felt the impact of that number until I started to meet more and more people who were a part of this world of disability for so many different reasons: invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses and learning disabilities, and people who became disabled over time through the very ordinary process of aging. The symbol of disability that we've kind of come to culturally recognize is that wheelchair with the blue background, right? It's on the parking spaces and the accessible stalls and the bathrooms. But yes, disability totally involves wheelchairs sometimes, but it's about so much beyond wheelchairs. It's ADHD and PTSD and MS and CP. It's traumatic brain injuries. It's anywhere on the autism spectrum. It's cancer and epilepsy. It's folks who are blind or have low vision. It's folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. It's chronic pain and chronic illness. And I could like take us into the afternoon, right? I started to realize that the experience of disability is deep and wide and sprawling and everywhere. I saw that disability permeates every possible category, demographic, and intersection of human identity: race and gender and geographic location and political and religious beliefs and class and educational backgrounds. And by extension, accessibility is about so much more than ramps and elevators, although I will always throw up my praise hands for every ramp and working elevator, but it's also ASL and alt text, it's closed captioning and transcripts, it's lighting and sound, it's website design and digital access, it's flexibility and openness. And according to disability activists Alice Wong and Mia Mungus and Sandy Ho, access is love. It's not an afterthought. It's not a begrudging obligation. It's an act of love. It's a giant sign that says, we want you here. You belong here. And these discoveries were important to me because I realized that this story that had felt so personally revelatory for me was revelatory for so many of us, that so many of us were on the edges for so many reasons. So much has changed since the 1940s, since 1977, since 1990. But in all of that, I think we can account for the fact that we have come so far And it is equally true that we have so far to go. Both of those things are deeply, equally true. I mean, public spaces have been legally obligated to design with accessibility in mind since the ADA in 1990. This is almost 35 years ago, and still there is so much resistance and kind of barriers to abiding by it. Just to give you the tiniest example of what I mean, as of January of this year, 150 out of 472 subway stations in New York City are considered somewhat accessible. I'm putting air quotes around that. I don't even really know what that means. But I think that means that at least 68% of them are not at all accessible, and that is 35 years after the ADA. We still have institutions who will funnel billions of dollars into designs and not consider disability and access until way after the fact, often until it feels too late. There are still so many people who think of accessibility as the luxury, the bonus that you can kind of tack on once you address everything else. Even when disability supports do exist, it's often in sort of an inaccessible maze to figure out how to access them. Most affordable housing remains inaccessible. Folks with disabilities experience higher rates of poverty and incarceration. We're far less likely to attend college. We're twice as likely to be unemployed as our non-disabled peers. There are still so many barriers. There's still so much resistance to including disability. And yet, the longer I'm alive, the more I've found that disability really gets to the heartbeat of what it means to be a human. Life in a body is this flurry of growth and aging. It's perpetual transition and adaptation. It's this constant push and pull between resilience and frailty. It's relentless creative problem solving. My attempt to separate myself from my disability when I was younger only made my life smaller. And I see a similar pattern unfolding on a societal level. When we distance ourselves from disability as communities, as a culture, when we keep disability on the edges, when we tune out that perspective, we cut ourselves off from a vital part of humanity. It leaves us all less equipped, building worlds and systems and stories that only are accessible to some of us, and even then, only temporarily. For a long time, the disability rights movement has been about pushing for legislation to include disability in society, right? Like, let us into your classrooms, into your workplaces, into your public transportation. And all of that work has been vital. I think that has changed the world for the better. I just don't know if that's the end goal that I imagine. I think I'd like to imagine a future that isn't only interested in letting disabled people participate in the quote unquote normal world. I'd like to imagine a world where we can let go of our grip on this notion of normal as a valuable benchmark, where conversations about access are deeply embedded in how we do community. I don't think it's just about letting folks with disabilities in the door and then holding the status quo. I think it's about allowing the inclusion of disability in our communities to inspire a revision to the script. It's looking to disability not as this fringe experience, not as someone to include because it's quote unquote the right thing to do, but as an experience and perspective that we desperately need in the world, with the same kind of urgency that the Air Force felt when they realized that their planes were crashing and they didn't know how to stop it. The way we build the world tells a story about who we believe belongs in that world, who we think this is all for. And instead of keeping disability pushed to the edges, included in the series of awkward workarounds and afterthought amendments, I want us to pull disability into the center of the conversation, of the room, of the drawing board, really to the center of our imaginations. That is the hope that I am holding on to these days. So thank you for your time and attention.